We need to wake up and get on board with the possibility that Ole Miss could win the whole dang thing. They could. Hello and welcome. It's always college football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy, and we appreciate you coming to us here on Monday, July 29th. Happy 5.5 birthday, I guess, to my oldest. I don't know how you say that. 5.5 it's like it's a half birthday. Happy half birthday. I don't know. Those are big though when you're in single digits. So happy 5.5 birthday, I suppose. Either way, we appreciate you being here. A lot to look forward to. Whether that's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or ESPN's YouTube channel. Thanks for being here. No matter how you get here, it doesn't matter. We're always very grateful to those of you that come to us from wherever it is you're coming to us from. We have everybody that's alongside, as always, Mark Kubiak, Jack Foster, and Jake Garcia. And today, we've done this for the last few shows. We are putting teams into tiers heading into the upcoming season. Tier 1, national championship contenders. Tier 2, playoff contenders. Tier 3, spoilers, which basically means the floor should be 8 wins, but there's a possibility you could rally up. Tier 4 are teams that are almost guaranteed to go to the postseason, but their ceiling's at about 8 wins. And then Tier 5 are teams that make postseasons that would be a remarkable achievement. So we'll do that again. We've done the Big Ten. So if you missed that, check that out. We did the ACC last week. You can check that out as well. Today, we will dive into the Southeastern Conference. And I think it's going to be pretty interesting because I perceive the league to be a little different than other people do. Okay? I think the tiers are pretty obvious, but at the same time, there might be a team or two that I feel a little better about and a team or two that maybe I don't feel quite as good about. So we will go through that today. So let's not waste any additional time. Let's dive in. It's the tiers in the Southeastern Conference. We will start in Tier 1. Where else would we start? Teams that have a legitimate chance to win a national championship. We will start with the team at the top of the SEC on paper, and that is the Georgia Bulldogs. Kirby Smart's done an amazing job, continues to replenish great personnel. Yes, they have losses, just like always. The biggest loss probably being Brock Bowers. But how many times have they had losses in the last few years? And yet it's not like the program drops off in any particular spot. Now, last year, I would argue that the front seven defensively has not been up to the standard. But when we evaluate Georgia, the standard is different than that of your average football team. And I think people have a hard time understanding that. It's like, well, Georgia defensive line, not as good. Doesn't mean they're not still great. They're not as good as the 2021 version of the Georgia Bulldogs. Okay, so they are in the category amongst teams that get measured against themselves, not against the rest of the sport, not against the, what's that line they have in baseball? WAR, right? Wins against replacement. They're not being used in the WAR scale. Like, they are being measured against Georgia and the best versions of Georgia. So, yeah, there are aspects of this year's team that might not be as good as the teams that have won national championships or competed for them, but they might be better in some other places, like a quarterback. And I think Carson Beck is the best quarterback that Georgia's had in quite some time. Just an amazing performance last year, almost 4,000 yards, school record, completing 72% of his passes. And if you look too at about how they kind of brought him along last year, he really wasn't asked to do a whole lot in the first 3 or 4 games. And then the Kentucky game happened, and it's like, all right, Carson, we're going to unleash you on the world. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, he got better as the season went along. The intermediate throws, the deep throws, getting the ball up and over defenders. Carson Beck's as talented as almost any quarterback in the sport. There's a reason why when you look at all the mock drafts for 2025, he's up near the top. Whether he's 1, 2, 3, or 4, he's up there in the top 5 almost universally. So their quarterback is back. They do lose a couple key pieces in the backfield. Daijun Edwards and Kendall Milton are both gone. But they did bring in one of the better impact players at the position, one of the more versatile players at the position in the country, in Trevor Etienne from Florida. Now, there, he had to kind of split carries with Montrell Johnson, but ETN, extremely dynamic out of the backfield as a pass catcher, and should be spelled alongside Branson Robinson, who was hurt early in the season last year. They also brought in great recruits, like they always do at almost every position. The offensive line should be super elite. And there shouldn't be a whole lot that you need to be concerned about with what they have offensively. And then we talk about Brock Bowers and the weapons. They're going to be great at wide receiver. I feel great about that position. But Brock Bowers being gone is something that has kind of kept me up. But the more I've talked to people associated with Georgia, the more I continue to hear the name Ben Urashek from Stanford, who is transferring in at the tight end spot. Now, he was great in the Pac-12 last year. He was great out there on the West Coast, very productive on an offense and a team, frankly, that wasn't very good. I continue to hear his name as a guy that might be a difference maker. So remember that name, tight end Benjamin Urasek. All right, keep an eye on that name. Defensively, yeah, they lose some really quality pieces in the back end. In the first 90 picks, they had Kamari Lassiter, Javon Bullard, and Tyke Smith. All got drafted. All will likely be good NFL players. But the front seven, they return for the most part intact. Feel good about their group. Yeah, they lose Jamin Dumas Johnson, lose a couple other guys. They're going to be all right in the front seven with returnees. Here's the problem. 2023 rushing defense statistics. Okay? Remember, we are not comparing Georgia to your average FBS football team. I am comparing Georgia, to the best versions of Georgia. Okay? If you can't stop the run in the SEC, you're going to have some issues. In 2023, they were 20th in the sport against the run. They gave up 114 yards per game. That was probably inflated with a couple performances. The Bama game, the Georgia Tech game, the Missouri game. They got gashed on the ground. They were 37th in yards per carry given up. They also had 8% negative play rate. That was 66th in the country. So they weren't creating a lot of disruption. They weren't having as many tackles for losses maybe they've had in the past. They also gave up a decent amount of explosive runs. So when I think Georgia, and I think front seven defensively, where they were when they were winning national championships just a couple years ago, I never saw them allowing 115 yards a game on the ground. It was probably closer to 70 than it was 120. So that has to be an area that gets addressed. So if there's one thing that would keep me up at night if I were Kirby Smart, it'd be the front seven defensively, but I do think they should improve at that spot. The other thing that would keep me up would be the schedule. You have 6 home games, you got 2 neutral sites. Okay? Then you have 4 true road games. How about these road games? Okay? Kentucky, perennial bowl team. At Alabama, perennial playoff contender. At Texas, playoff team last year. Likely a playoff contender for the foreseeable future. At Ole Miss. Okay? At Ole Miss, at Texas, at Alabama, and at Kentucky. And Kentucky, by the way, has played Georgia, with the exception of last year, better than most teams the last few years. So 4 very difficult road games. Then you got 2 neutral sites. Clemson, top 15 team, top 10 program. Florida, not a top 15 team, but traditionally probably a top 10 to 15 program. In some years better than that. Then you get Tennessee at home. So it's a very, very difficult schedule. Extremely difficult schedule. One that I think they can navigate, but I'm not sure they'll be able to navigate it unscathed. However, they're still, by far and away, Tier 1 status in the SEC. Another team in Tier 1, that would be the Texas Longhorns. Now, Quinn Ewers progressed mightily, almost to the point in which his play last year from an efficiency standpoint was unrecognizable from where it was the year before. Now, there were some really bright spots in his year 1 with Steve Sarkisian. There were some great moments, but there were also some moments where you were kind of left scratching your head. But burned a lot of plays, wasn't crazy efficient, didn't anticipate the way he needed to anticipate. But here's the good thing. He went from 73rd 2 years ago to 17th in QBR. His completion percentage went from 58% to 69%. He went from 7.4 yards per attempt to 8.8 yards per attempt. That's all from year 1 to year 2. Well, imagine just how much better he could get from year 2 to year 3. And one thing that I've liked a lot about Quinn Ewers is that he seems to play his best football as the game goes along. So maybe a little early, a little tight, kind of figures out what they are, and then you see a better version of him in the second half. So I'm really optimistic about where he's heading and just how he's going to continue to progress, because he's going to be without some elite guys that he shared the huddle with last year. He shared the huddle with Bijan Robinson. He shared the huddle with Jonathan Brooks. Shared the huddle with Whittington, Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy. All those guys are now gone. So he's going to have to do it a little bit more on his own. Now, CJ Baxter and Jaden Blue, not worried about the running back spot. Those guys will be just fine. They will be just fine at running back. That I'm not concerned about. Offensive line returns almost entirely intact. Not worried about that position. Was at first a little worried about the wideouts. I'm going to be honest. I loved their trio last year. Well, it helps when you can go out and sign the number 1 wide receiver off multiple Power 5 teams and just reinforce what was lost and the roles that those pieces occupied. You go out, you get Isaiah Bond at Alabama, stepped up in big moments, just like A.D. Mitchell did in the past. Matthew Golden from Houston. He's done a lot of really nice things. Torched him last year, by the way. He's probably going to fill that Jordan Whittington role. Then you have Silas Bolden from Oregon State, who may be a little undersized, like Xavier Worthy, but he's a speedster and can do a lot in the return game. So those guys fill the voids of the guys that just departed. Not to mention you have a couple guys that they're real excited about. And Jonte Cook, who's going into year number 2, was situational player last year, but not very many situations that we see him on the field. And Ryan Wingo, who's a 5-star that everyone thinks might climb on the depth chart and have an immediate impact. So I think they're in a really good spot. The one thing that would keep me up at night if I were Steve Sarkisian is that the secondary last year was a little problematic. Statistically speaking, it was ugly. Yeah, you couldn't run the ball against them because of how good they were up front, so you had to take to the air, and they didn't do a great job of defending the pass. They were 116th last year in passing yards allowed. They were 57th in yards per attempt allowed. They were 49th in QBR, and they were 74th in completion percentage allowed. All those areas need to improve. And I like their personnel on the back end. I do. I think they're going to be fine. I think they'll be improved in the back end defensively. I also think the pass rush has a chance to be a little bit better on the edges. Defensive tackle, though, they got to figure out that position group, because if they can't stop the run, much like we just talked about with Georgia, if you can't stop the run with the same level of dominance that you stopped it with last year, that could potentially be problematic, especially when taking into account the teams that you're going to play against. Michigan on the road, you know they're going to try to pound the football. Oklahoma, not really a team that's going to ground and pound you, not at least at that point of the season. But Michigan will. Oklahoma could. Georgia will try to ground and pound you. Florida, look at Billy Napier's track record. They're going to try to ground and pound you. Arkansas, you're on the road there in November. You look at what Arkansas has, and Taylon Green at quarterback, like they're going to try to run the football. They're going to try to be physical with the downhill rushing attack. Kentucky, we know they want to run the football. So you're catching a trend here. If for whatever reason they're not as good against the run as they were a year ago, they face a lot of teams that are going to try to pound the football. So I hope there's not much drop-off on that side of the ball. I don't think there will be, because they have depth and they've recruited at the position. But that's something that I would be paying close attention to. The secondary and the front seven, in particular, the 2 defensive tackles. But still, Texas, they're a national championship contender, especially with what they bring back on the offensive side. Let's go next to another Tier 1 team, the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, a lot of people want to take Alabama out of this discussion. I understand that, because people have so much respect for Nick Saban. But here's what I've kind of come to realize. You can respect Nick Saban and what he's done and still acknowledge that Alabama might be still pretty good moving forward under Kalen DeBoer. Like, if you give Kalen DeBoer his flowers, you're not taking away from what Nick Saban's accomplished. And I think people are having a difficult time with that right now. I mean, Kalen DeBoer is fresh off a 25-3 record at Washington the last couple of years. He was 67-3 in NAIA. As a Division I head coach, he's 37-9. He's 12-2 against ranked opponents at both Washington and Fresno State. And he just had 10 guys drafted in the NFL. I mean, I think he knows what he's doing. And if you look at what Alabama lost, there's a lot of people focusing on what Alabama lost and not enough people focusing on what they have. Okay, you lose the top 2 running backs, lose the top 3 pass catchers, you lose your top tight end, you lose a couple pieces defensively that are very difficult to replace, especially at corner and especially at the edges of the defense. I understand all of that, but there's top 100 recruits almost everywhere. Like for running back, for example, let's start there. Okay, yeah, you lose Jace McClellan, you lose Roydell Williams. Jace McClellan goes to the NFL, Roydell Williams goes to Florida State. Well, neither were likely going to be able to hold off Justice Haynes and Jam Miller moving into this year. Like those guys were already starting to encroach on the touches. They might have overtaken the two guys that departed the program had they decided to stick around. Then you add in Richard Young, who's a really physical downhill runner, and you got some versatility at that position. I think the offensive line, guard to guard, most people say maybe the best group guard to guard in the country. I don't know if they are or not. I know they're pretty dang good. I look at the receivers, for example. People focus on, Jermaine Burton's gone. I don't think they were too disappointed to see Jermaine Burton go. Isaiah Bond's gone. Huge loss, in my opinion. Isaiah Bond could have really helped this team. No doubt about it. But I think they have guys. It's not like Isaiah Bond was a 1,200-yard receiver and the next best guy that was coming back is a 400-yard receiver. Like the gap was not that significant. So I feel like his loss will be huge for Texas and very beneficial addition for the Horns. But it doesn't mean Alabama doesn't have guys that were nipping at his heels to try to potentially take some of those touches away. Malik Benson transferred. He couldn't even get on the field for the most part last year. Ja'Cory Brooks transferred to Louisville. He barely played last year. So when people are focusing on the departures offensively, and yet you still got Kobe Prentice, you still got Kendrick Law, you still got Jalen Hale. All those guys were in the rotation last year. They have 5 guys that were at 1.4 or 5-star recruits, including a 5-star freshman from Saraland, Ryan Williams, and a potential impact transfer from Washington who was just buried beneath 3 big-time wideouts for Washington last year in Jeremy Bernard. So I just look at everything that Alabama brings back offensively, they're going to be fine. Then defensively, yes, you will miss the edge presence that was Dallas Turner. You will miss the edge presence that was Chris Braswell for sure. You will miss the corners big time. But I do think they've adequately addressed some of those pieces in the transfer portal, but they do get young and they will get inexperienced very quickly in the event in which they can't stay healthy. So I do think Alabama is maybe on slightly thinner ice as far as depth is concerned, but their best is still as good as anybody else in the entire conference. Their best is still as good as just about everybody in the sport. Let's look at the schedule. I didn't even mention Jalen Milroe, by the way, in my breakdown because I think people are okay with the fact that we know he's good. But people need to be told about some of the other pieces. At Wisconsin, that's a game that will be a great challenge, but one they should win. Georgia, they've beaten Georgia 2 of the last 3. I'm not saying they're going to do it again. I'm just saying they've beaten them 2 of the last 3, and they get them at home. At Tennessee, they beat Tennessee by a couple touchdowns last year and were -1 in the turnover margin. It's at Tennessee. It's going to be a very difficult game. Tough one to win, but one that I think they can probably get. You get Missouri. It's going to be a very difficult game. It's following the Tennessee game, and Missouri's a preseason top 10 team, but it's at home. You go to LSU. LSU had difficult times making any stops defensively. They got to be better on that side of the ball if they're going to beat Bama, even if it's at home. At Oklahoma. By that point, Oklahoma will have run an absolute gauntlet. Who knows what they're going to be in week 11. Then you get Auburn, the Iron Bowl at home. So I look at Bama, still think they're tier 1, still think they can beat everybody. They just don't have the same level of depth that they've had in the past, where if they lost a 5-star because he tweaked a hamstring, well, in comes the next 5-star off the bench. They don't have that luxury anymore, but their best is still as good as anybody in the sport. Let's go next to another tier 1 team, And people will push back on this because they don't acknowledge the championship possibilities of a team that hasn't been there. We need to wake up and get on board with the possibility that Ole Miss could win the whole dang thing. They could. Okay. I just put Penn State in tier 1 a week ago. Okay. Penn State was in tier 1 when I did the Big Ten. Why? Because I love their roster. Well, I also went back, and I know we can't use bowl games as the ultimate indicator of future success. If you do, you probably shouldn't. But I did see the number 1 defense in the country on the field that day, and I did see an Ole Miss offense that dropped 38 points and 540 yards against the number 1 defense in the country. I also look at what they have back on offense. They returned 8 guys that started for them last year. Then they went out and added about a handful of other starters from other places that are only going to reinforce the quality that they had coming back. Jackson Dart is excellent, has been for a while, was challenged last year in the offseason, came out a better player as a result of the 3-way quarterback battle that they had throughout the 23 campaign. Well, now he's looking back and he's thrown for over 6,000 yards. Pretty good. One of 2 quarterbacks in the SEC that's thrown for 6,000 yards. You do have a couple of questions. Sure, you lose Quinshon Judkins. That's fine. Ulysses Bentley steps right in. He averaged almost 6 yards a carry last year. The wide receivers, no one's pushing back on that. Trey Harris is back. Jordan Watkins is back. Caden Priestcorn's back at tight end. You add Juice Wells from South Carolina, a guy that was a preseason all-SEC player going into last year. Was banged up last year for the most part, but they have the weapons. But the problem with Ole Miss for a long time, it's always been that they had weapons, but on the line of scrimmage, offensively and defensively, they weren't quite as good as some of the teams that they would play. They weren't as good as Georgia. They weren't as good as Bama. They weren't as good as LSU along both lines of scrimmage. That now has changed with some of the additions they've made in the portal. A couple of big additions along the offensive line, but along the defensive lines where it might be felt more. Walter Nolan transfers in from Texas A&M, was number 1 recruit in the world a couple years ago. They also bring in Princely Umanmielen, who led Florida in tackles for loss, sacks, and quarterback hurries. This was a team last year that was 70th in total defense and 382 yards per game given up, and they gave up 153 yards a game in rush defense. That was 73rd. Okay. That's not going to be the case this year. I expect them to be much better defensively, and I expect them to be a whole heck of a lot stouter against the run with some of the additions they've made in the portal. Look at the schedule, too. The non-conference shouldn't cause any problems. They go to Wake in week 3. Other than that, should be able to handle their business and route to a 4-0 start. At LSU on October 12th will be a very difficult game. Could be a shootout. They had 700 yards of offense against LSU last year. Oklahoma, they come to Oxford on October 26th. So they really have a month to kind of get their ducks in a row before things tighten up in the middle of October and get a little bit tighter as the rest of the season goes along. I do think their final 5 games are challenging, for sure. Egg Bowl is always tough, but you got Oklahoma on the 26th of October. You got Georgia on the 9th. They come to them. And then you go to Florida on November 23rd. So I do think there are challenges there in the back end, but still, they're going to probably get to the college football playoff. And I think when they get there, they can win some games and route to a possible national championship opportunity. Moving into tier 2, these are teams that should be in playoff contention. Okay, they should be there. Just whether they make it or not, I don't know. But they should finish the season in the top 15 or 20 at the very worst. Okay, Tennessee, we'll start there. 9-win year last year, 11-2 the year before. They're 20-6 in the last 2 years. That's the best record they've had in 20 years. And I think the 9 wins last year were in spite of a very, very inconsistent passing attack. And when you think about Tennessee's offense, I think big plays, right? I think down the field passing. I think hard play action, hit a guy in a one-on-one situation. That guy wins the one-on-one situation. You can't cover him. Well, Joe Milton, didn't hit a lot of those throws. He missed a lot, frankly. Now, he didn't throw a lot of picks either. So there are some solid things to take from the Joe Milton experience last year, but there wasn't enough consistency. Okay. They were 95th last year in explosive passing attack. They were 51st in passing last year, 50th in yards per attempt, 44th in QBR. That's not going to be good enough. When you have an offense that puts this much on your quarterback's shoulders, you got to have a difference maker at the position, and Joe Milton was not that. In steps Nico Iamaleava. All right. I think he's got all the talent in the world. All the talent in the world. What I saw in the bowl game was more quick twitch mobility than I anticipated. And I don't think he's going to miss as many throws as Milton did. That's a personal opinion. Could be dead wrong. We'll look forward at the end of the season and review his passing accuracy statistics. But I feel pretty good about what I've seen in limited work. I also think an entire offseason getting more and more comfortable with his wide receivers is going to be beneficial. Brew McCoy is back. I think that's big. Him being out last year was not ideal. Squirrel White is back. Hopefully Dante Thornton can finally reach his potential. We talked a lot about him in the offseason, but it didn't really materialize last year. So their receivers are stacked. And then the addition of Chris Brazzell. If Chris Brazzell can do the things at Tennessee that he was able to do at times at Tulane, then this passing attack could go 4 wide or even 5 wide with the addition of Holden Stays from Notre Dame, the tight end. I think they have a really deep repertoire of weapons on the perimeter. I do think they'll miss Jalen Wright and Jabari Small. I mean, these guys leave with a ton of productivity. That's not ideal. But we know Dylan Sampson has had some pretty good moments in his Tennessee uniform. Did some great things against Virginia, looked really good against Kentucky, and then against Iowa, he looked like he's capable of being a number 1 back. Part of the reason why I'm most optimistic about Tennessee, though, is the steady improvement that we've seen on the defensive side. It's 36 sacks last year, 100-plus tackles for loss. They've done that 2 of the last 3 years. And I think Tim Banks is probably one of the more underappreciated coordinators in the country. They utilize a bunch of players, probably rotate 10 guys along the defensive line, and pretty much everybody's back. They're headlined by James Pierce, who is a monster. They got their 5 defensive tackles back as well. The biggest problem is the secondary. They lose a bunch of guys, but they weren't that great last year to begin with. They were middle of the pack in just about every category and 121st in completion percentage. So you look at their secondary, sometimes it's great to have returnees. Well, when the production wasn't great, I'm not that disappointed about losing 5 guys at that position. I think the schedule sets up okay as well. NC State, that's a tough game. I know Tennessee fans will look at NC State and say, oh, that's a win, and Charlotte will handle our business there. That game is very, very difficult. I'm a believer in NC State. I think more and more people are starting to come to terms with the fact that NC State might finally get to the 10-win plateau this year. They could definitely do it and take a big step forward with the win over Tennessee in Charlotte. So be careful in that game. On the road at Oklahoma, you know Oklahoma's going to have this one circled. All right? It means a lot to you because it's the first game of the SEC schedule. It means more to Oklahoma because their head coach or their former quarterback, their former OC, their first game in the SEC, it's at home. Like, this game means a lot to Oklahoma. If you can go into Norman and get a win there, that's like winning 2 games, I think, because of the level of emotion that's going to be on the line there in Norman. That 4th game of the year, I believe, 3rd game of the year, whatever week it is. Florida, you got to beat them. You get them at home. Last year, it was not super competitive. You got to take care of business this year at home. You get Bama at your place. You get Kentucky at your place, and you go to Georgia. I look at Kentucky game. That's a must-win. Bama game, I think that's one. That one, Florida, NC State. I mean, these are all games that can be won. They could run the table potentially. If Nico Iamaleava is the guy that we all think he might be, I mean, I'm not saying they're going undefeated, but you can win every single game just listed. So I think the schedule is pretty dang manageable with the exception of the road trip to Georgia at the end of the year. That one, I think they might have a difficult time with, but I love where they're at right there, and they should be a college football playoff contender here in 2024. Another that is a CFP contender is the Missouri Tigers. Had they had a 12-team playoff last year, Missouri would have been in. They do have to replace some key pieces. Cody Schrader's gone, but they did bring in Marcus Carroll from Georgia State, Nate Noel from App State. Both are really comfortable running the same style of attack that Cody Schrader excelled in last year. They combined for 2,200 yards and 18 touchdowns last year. So they're going to be in a good spot at the running back position. We know they're elite at the wide receiver spot. Luther Burden, I think he's the best receiver in America. Theo Weiss and Mookie Cooper, both were highly touted prospects and continue to be really, really solid. I think they're in really good position on the offensive side. Brady Cook's back for a 3rd year. The defense is where I think most of the questions reside. Corey Batoon steps in as the defensive coordinator. Remember, Blake Baker left for LSU. He was South Alabama's DC last year, and he's going to adjust a little bit to the 4-2-5 that they ran with success last year. It's worked, and their current personnel, I think, fits what they want to be. So he's having to adjust more than Missouri's having to adjust. I think there's better personnel there than I might have thought coming out of the spring. The more I've dove in, the more I feel a little bit better about what they have defensively. I still think there could be some growing pains, but I think the sky's the limit for Missouri this year, and they can definitely get to the college football playoff. The problem is, I don't think their schedule is that difficult. That's a blessing and a curse. At A&M, Auburn, at Alabama, and Oklahoma. Those are kind of the four marquee games, okay? Let's say you lose two of the four. Well, A&M's projected to win around 8 games. Auburn's projected to win around 7 games. Alabama's projected to win 9 or 10. And Oklahoma's projected to win 7 or 8. So let's say you lose 2 of those games. Is your schedule strength going to be difficult enough to still garner an at-large spot? That's a legitimate question for Missouri. Is their schedule hard enough? Because it is probably the most manageable in the entire Southeastern Conference. Another college football playoff contender, the LSU Tigers. They lost Mike Denbrock, the longtime offensive coordinator. He's back at Notre Dame. To try to keep some continuity, they promote Joe Sloan, who's an excellent coach, and he's going to do a great job with Garrett Nussmeier, who's waited at quarterback patiently, sat behind the former Heisman Trophy winner, and took control of the team en route to a near 400-yard performance and a long 95-plus yard game-winning drive against Wisconsin in the bowl game. You look at how he played in the spring game. The guy's going to take a lot of shots. He's going to put a ton of air under the football, and he's going to create a lot of big plays. He's a gunslinger. All right, he's got some great weapons at his disposal. Kyron Lacey, sure, he was the number 3 wide receiver last year. He'll move into the top spot. Shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. You got a top 50 wide receiver in Chris Hilton that will also be out there, but don't lose sleep on CJ Daniels, who's transferring over from Liberty and went for over 1,000 yards. Xavion Thomas also transferred in from Mississippi State, so they should be in a great spot, and the offensive line is one of the best in the sport. Defensively, they need a complete refresh. They fired everybody. They bring in Blake Baker, and he turned Missouri into one of the worst units into one of the best units almost overnight. En route to an 11-win season last year. It's going to be aggressive. He's going to allow these guys to play with great athleticism. They're going to play with a lot of speed. And I do think that will be beneficial with the personnel that LSU returns on that side of the ball. The schedule, I think it's tough, but manageable at the same time. SC's in a neutral site. You get UCLA as well. 2 games that right now I think LSU will be a heavy favorite in. Ole Miss comes to U. That was a shootout last year, but that's a big opportunity for LSU to kind of announce their presence to the college football world. Right now, people aren't quite sure about them. They are sure about Ole Miss, but Ole Miss heads to the Bayou and plays on Saturday night in Death Valley. LSU gets a win, then get ready. Here they come. They go to A&M, which will be a very tricky game. Alabama comes to them. They go to Florida towards the end of the year, and then Oklahoma comes to them in the final game of the regular season. So LSU, I'm warmed up more and more to them, and I'm starting to feel more bullish about what the Tigers might be this year today than I have been at any point already this offseason. Moving into Tier 3 now. Tier 3, these are the spoilers, okay? The floor should be 8 wins. Understand that? The floor should be 8 wins, and they can spoil anyone's season that I've listed up to this point. Tier 1, Tier 2, championship contenders, playoff contenders. Now we get in the spoilers. I don't know if they can quite make the playoff, but they can ruin anyone's season at any one given point. They're going to be rock solid across the board. Let's start with the Oklahoma Sooners. Ton of dominance in the Big 12. Tons. 13 Big 12 titles in the last 20 years. Basically from 2001 to 2020, they had 13 Big 12 titles. All right, so they have been incredible. Now, offensively, there's some turnover, okay? There's a lot of turnover offensively. Totally new offensive line, new slot receiver since Drake Stoops is gone. You also lose Dylan Gabriel. I don't feel like we've spent enough time on the turnover that Oklahoma has experienced offensively. Now, we all feel good about what Jackson Arnold might be. He might be great, or he might have growing pains. Either way, he's got a lot of talent. I do think he's got some talent waiting in the wings along the perimeter, too, that he can rely on. Whether it's Andrell Anthony, who before the injury looked poised to become a real difference maker for Oklahoma. Jalil Farouk, he's an all SEC potential type of player. Nick Anderson was very solid, but don't sleep on the addition of Deion Burks from Purdue. He looked incredible in the spring game. You take that game with a grain of salt because it's the spring game. If you talk to anybody that's familiar with this game, the sky's the limit for that young man. So I think the offense, assuming the offensive line can get taken care of, they should be in a really good spot. And defensively, they got a real chance to be a top 10 defense. You lose a couple guys in the trenches. You get to lose a few there, but you bring in a couple too from the portal that you feel pretty good about. And you look at the second level, you know their linebackers are going to be rock solid. Those guys are all back. Everyone's back in the secondary. A couple of guys thought, hey, maybe I'd go. Billy Bowman thought maybe I'll go. Nope, decided to stick around and put his NFL future on hold for the moment. The schedule's very difficult. Tennessee comes to you. We've talked about that game already. On the road at Auburn. Be careful there. I could see them beating Tennessee and then going on the road and losing Auburn. Okay, Tennessee's better than Auburn, but still very difficult road trip, and Oklahoma will learn quickly how hard it is to go on the road in this league when they travel to the Plains. Texas, of course, the neutral site. They're at Ole Miss. They're at Missouri. Two games that will be very difficult against playoff contending teams. Alabama comes to them in the second to last week of the regular season. And then their final game in the regular season, congratulations, you get to go to Death Valley. So very difficult schedule for Brent Venables in year 3. That's why they are in tier 3 as one of the spoilers, but not a legitimate playoff contender this year. Let's go next to the Texas A&M Aggies. Mike Elko takes over for a place that has traditionally put a lot of emphasis on the offensive side of the football, whether it's Kevin Sumlin, Jimbo Fisher. It feels like the offense has always kind of been front and center for A&M, at least in the last few years. Well, offensively, I think they got a chance to be pretty good. Defensively, they haven't been a problem. The defense has been rock solid. When he took over at Duke, Mike Elko was inheriting a rebuild. Well, now they're already pretty stout. They've had top 20 defenses for a really long time. And they go out, add Nick Scorton from Purdue. You have a couple of returnees from that 2022 signing class that are now in year number 3. Defensively, I think they got a lot of answers. Offensively, there are a couple questions. Colin Klein is the new offensive coordinator. He played quarterback, so I think that will help. And I think he's going to do a really good job of making sure Connor Wigman, the starting quarterback, can stay healthy. He hasn't been able to do that the last couple of years, but if you look at where Colin Klein has excelled, it's situational awareness. They've been able to run the ball well in the red zone. They've been really good on third down. There's a lot of things to like about what Colin Klein did at his alma mater, Kansas State. Now, you do have a bunch of guys coming in at receiver and tight end. You have a bunch of guys that feel like they're rock solid number 2 wideout options. Who's the number 1? We'll find out. Either way, though, I think the offense is going to be in a really good spot. What I like most about A&M is the schedule and the opportunities that are sitting there to fall in line with the, quote, spoiler role. You got Notre Dame. We all know Notre Dame's a top 10 team in the country coming in. Well, guess what? They're on the road at A&M week 1. You go to Florida. That's a tricky game for sure. You host Missouri. A lot of people have Missouri in the top 10 in the preseason. Well, they come to you. You host LSU. Some people think LSU's top 15, top 20 team. Maybe by that point, by the time you play them, maybe they're a little higher than that. You get a chance to host them. You go to Auburn, be a very tricky game. Going to Auburn's always tough. Then you got the Texas Longhorns, a team that everybody has in the top 3 or 4 in the country. You get to host them in the return of the Texas A&M Texas game at the end of the regular season. So I love the role that A&M will play this year. They're the spoilers for sure. I think they can get to 8 wins. I think they can get to 9 wins. They could even get to 10, but they're going to ruin a couple team seasons along the way. That is for sure. Another team that would fall under the spoiler category, that'd be the Auburn Tigers. Now, Auburn, they always seem to kind of wear the hat that is the spoiler. Last year, they almost got Georgia. They almost got Bama. Both those games were at home. Now they have to go on the road. But if you look at Hugh Freeze's track record, they're going to rally up and play really well in the big games. I think he went out and did a great job in recruiting this offseason. All right, you look at the areas in which Auburn's roster was not where it needed to be. They went out and addressed it. They go out and they get Cam Coleman. They go out and they get Perry Thompson, two of the highest rated recruits in the country at the wide receiver spot. Then they go out and add Robert Lewis from Georgia State, who should be really good at the slot spot there for Peyton Thorne, who's coming into year 2 with this offense and the better understanding of what this offense needs to be. He almost had 1,000 yards last year. Then they go out and they add Keandre Lambert-Smith, who was the number 1 wide receiver for Penn State last year, one of the top transfers in the cycle. Then Rivaldo Fairweather is back at the tight end spot. So you think the passing game is going to open things up for sure. I know I feel that way because Jarquez Hunter is still an extremely effective back, one of the best in the sport that nobody really talks about. So they have a good running back. You're going to have to respect the run game. And now you have guys that can legitimately win those one-on-ones on the outside. So I'm really bullish on what we're going to see from Auburn's offense. Defensively, new defensive coordinator and DJ Durkin, I think they should be in a pretty good spot. They're going to be solid at all 3 levels defensively. Probably middle of the pack in the SEC. I don't see them elevating up to the point where they're in the top 3, but I don't think they're going to regress to the point which they're in double digits. They're going to be right there, middle of the pack, solid as solid can be on that side of the ball. The schedule's tough. You got Cal at home, Arkansas at home, Oklahoma at home. You got to win your home games this year because you have a very difficult road schedule. You got to win your home games if you're Auburn. Cal, Arkansas, Oklahoma. You got to win those. You also have A&M at the end of the year that comes to you. If you can win your home games, you're in a great spot to make a lot of noise because the road trip are very difficult. At Georgia, at Missouri, at Alabama, 3 teams will be ranked in the top 10 in the preseason. And then you add in the game that could flip this thing in a hurry. Could flip them up to being a legit, hey, heck of a year, 9 wins, 8 wins. Or it could, if you lose this game on the road at Kentucky, then you could kind of fall off the cliff and be 7 wins, 6 wins. You never know. So that game, I think, is imperative. 2 most important games on the schedule, obviously outside of Georgia, outside of Alabama. Those are the 2 rivals. The 2 most important games when evaluating Auburn's progress this year, Oklahoma at home and Texas A&M at home alongside Kentucky on the road. You get 2 of those 3, you should feel great about it. You get 1 of those 3, should be really disappointed. If you go over, that would be bad news bears in year number 2. Moving into tier number 4, these are teams that should get to a bowl game. So the floor should be 6 wins, right? I look at these teams, and I think they're kind of dangerous, but really for the most part, maybe the schedule is not what I like. Maybe they have some question marks at certain spots, but for the most part, I like them enough to know that they'll get to the postseason. I just don't know if I like them enough to put them in the spoiler category just yet. I'm going to start with the Florida Gators. I think the receivers are going to be good. I think the quarterback's going to be good. I think the running game's going to be good. I think the defense will be better. Okay? They let go of a bunch of guys on defense. They decided to keep Austin Armstrong, their coordinator. They hired his former mentor, formerly of Auburn. Now he's at Florida, and Ron Roberts. There's a Baylor before that. So I kind of look at what they have. I think they can run the football. I think they're going to be more physical. And they went young. If you look at where they were in 2023, freshmen accounted for 14 touchdowns. All right. Nine different guys combined for 37 starts. They had a bunch of true freshmen that were playing in a ton of different games. So it felt like 2023, they were setting the foundation for what could come in 24 and what could come in 25. And you know, or at least you know if you listen to this show, I think the biggest jump that you have as a player is from year 1 to year 2. So if those guys played that much early, I would anticipate major growth at many different places this year for the Florida Gators. Now, everybody keeps going back to the schedule. The schedule's brutal, but you telling me they can't beat UCF? You telling me they can't beat Miami? You telling me they can't beat A&M? I think they can win those games. I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying they can. Can they go on the road and beat Tennessee? They beat Tennessee by a couple touchdowns last year. Yeah, it's on the road. Yeah, it'll be tough, but can they do it? Sure. Can they beat Kentucky at home? Can they beat Georgia in a neutral site? That one I have a hard time picturing, but is it possible? I don't know. At Texas, probably going to be tough. LSU at home, could they get that one? Ole Miss at home, could they get that one? I just look at these things and people just kind of want to write Florida off. I think Florida still has weapons. They still have dudes and they have young guys that are probably going to be a whole lot better this year because of what they experienced last year. Let's go next to another team that is, I think, definitely bowl game bound. That's Kentucky. Now, Kentucky last year started the season red hot, 5-0, looked great in a complete beatdown of Vanderbilt team. They looked great against Florida. and then they played Georgia and all came crashing down, right? But if you look at Kentucky, they beat the teams that they're supposed to beat, but for whatever reason, they struggled against the top dogs. So last year, Vandy, Florida, and Mississippi State, those teams went a combined 12 and 24. They handled their business against those teams. You look at the teams they lost to, they were almost 3-1 win to loss ratio. So Mark Stoops, dating back to his coordinator days, he's always going to have good secondary play, except last year. They were 93rd last year in pass defense, 90th in QBR allowed, 127th in completion percentage allowed. I expect major improvement on that side of the ball. Then defensively, I think they'll be better. Offensively, Bush Hamdan, there's two things that he's done. He's the new OC. There's two things he's done really well. Run the football, and I think he's done a pretty good job with quarterbacks in the past. All right. Brock Vandergrift steps in at quarterback. Chip Trayanum, the transfer from Ohio State, he steps in as the primary running back. And Bush Hamdan's offense at Boise State, they ran the ball 3/4 of the time. All right. 3/4 of the time, they're running the football. That should set up well for Chip Trayanum and an offensive line that returns a lot of experience. The schedule, South Carolina's at home, Georgia's at home. They've played Georgia pretty well the last couple of years with the exception of last year. They're at Ole Miss, they're at Florida. You get Auburn to come to you. That feels like a must win there for Kentucky. You're at Tennessee, will be very difficult. You're at Texas, very difficult. Then you get Louisville to finish off the regular season. I think this team should go to bowl game, but seeing them go beyond that, to me, is extremely difficult. Let's go next to the next team in tier number 4. I think this team's bowl game bound. Not a lot of people feel this way, but I think South Carolina is en route to the postseason. Look, they landed a top-tier running back transfer in Rocket Sanders. I think Lenoris Sellers, they kind of know who he is. I think he's capable enough through the year, but he's going to be a great and dynamic athlete with how they're going to adjust when the run game. At the offensive line, that's something that we got to watch very closely. The weapons, something we got to watch very closely. But I like what they have coming back on the offensive side of the football. Defensively, this is where I really feel good about them. All right. A lot of momentum that was started in 2024, and a lot of that momentum is now moving in to, their second year, and in some cases their third year in the system. They got 8 starters back. All right. The front 7 added some legit blue chip prospects. They added some legit FBS starters in the transfer portal. So Clayton White, I think, has a really solid track record, and yet this could be their best group yet. So I am optimistic about South Carolina this year. And you look at their schedule. The schedule's so hard for South Carolina. Old Dominion should get that one. They're at Kentucky, very difficult game. Host LSU, Akron at home. So if you can be 2-2 in your first 4, you got to feel pretty good about it. Problem is, you got to pull some spoilers down the stretch. You got to get a win over one of these 4 at home, or one of these 3 at home, excuse me. Ole Miss, A&M, Missouri. All 3 of those come to you. Very, very difficult. Can you get one win in those 3? That's a question mark, because that would get you now to 3 wins. You have another win in Wofford, and then you got to go on the road and get a win at Vanderbilt. You got to potentially go on the road and get a win at Kentucky. You got to potentially go on the road and get a win at Clemson. So very difficult to envision, but I think they can get there because I expect them to be that good on the defensive side. Let's move next to tier 5. These are teams that I would view a bowl trip as a really significant achievement, something that you should feel great about. We'll start with the Arkansas Razorbacks. Now, Arkansas, they are one of the bigger question marks in the league. Okay, we know they have a couple of really good pieces on defense. All right, a few that are flat out take over the game guys in some ways defensively. But is it going to be enough for Landon Jackson to kind of hold things down there in the front 7? The secondary has been a problem for quite a while. You look statistically at where they were last year. They were 94th in yards per attempt. They were 94th in QB rating given up. All right. They were 91st in explosive play rate through the air. So the secondary has been a problem for a while. That's not where you want to have issues when stepping into the SEC arena, because there's a lot of teams that can throw it all over the yard. That's for sure. The schedule is extremely difficult. I think a lot of it hinges on a road trip to Oklahoma State. You go and get that one, you're in a really great spot. You got to get one on the neutral side against A&M, potentially to get to the postseason, and you got to take care of business at some point at home against either Texas, Ole Miss, Tennessee, or LSU. All right, those are some really tough games. The good news is a bunch of them are at home. So maybe Arkansas rallies up and performs a whole lot better. I just think the schedule is a little bit too difficult this year to anticipate them getting to the postseason. But I do think they'll be able to run the football, and Bobby Petrino is going to emphasize the run game, and Taylor Green, their quarterback, is really dynamic. So keep an eye on Arkansas, but right now they're still in Tier 5. Let's go next to another team in Tier 5, Mississippi State. I think Mississippi State can score, all right? I know that. I know Mississippi State offensively is going to be in a really good spot. I think Blake Shapen at quarterback, their addition from Baylor, has a chance to be really solid. I think their weapons are pretty good. I think they'll be able to run the ball pretty well. So I actually really like what they have offensively. My biggest question for Mississippi State is on the defensive side. Because if you look at the defense last year, yes, there were some aspects of their defense last year that were really good. Problem is they weren't great against the pass, and that was with quality pieces in the secondary. So that's something I'll be watching. I know they're going to be pretty good against the run. Mississippi State's always been pretty good against the run, or at least they have been up to this point, but a lot of new faces on that side of the ball. So the defense is something that would keep me up at night right now if I were Jeff Levy, but should be really entertaining. If they can get to the postseason year one, that would be an outstanding achievement for Jeff Levy. So I think that should be the bar for success for them. And then finally, we'll go to the Vanderbilt Commodores, who are in Tier 5. It's just so hard to ask Clark Lee to do the things that he's expected to do in a world in which the SEC just got much more difficult, okay? I don't think anybody anticipates them competing for a conference title at any point. But I think if you can take a few steps forward, that would be significant achievement. I look at Vegas saying like 2.5 or so. I think they'll be better than that. I think they've done a pretty good job of bringing in some talent. They've done a pretty good job of creating an identity. I think they have a couple guys on defense that could do some nice things for Clark Lee. But will they have enough to be able to go and get wins against, say, South Carolina at home? Can they beat Tennessee at home? Can they beat Texas at home? Probably not. Then how many times is Vandy going to be able to go on the road and get a win? Right? Can they go to Missouri and get a win? Can they go to Auburn and get a win? These are all things that I envision to be very, very difficult. So I think a big game for Vandy will be that Virginia Tech game in week 1. If they can get that one, that'd be a huge, huge coup for Clark Lee heading in to this upcoming season. But man, Tier 5 is where Vandy lives right now and probably live for the foreseeable future. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to like, rate, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your show. We appreciate all of you. We see our numbers growing up like crazy here in August. People very excited about the season. Believe me, we are equally excited. Thursday, we will do our tiers for the Big 12, but we're probably going to spend a little bit of time too on the mailbag. So submit some questions at Always CFB, whatever question you have. I don't care if it's a question about Old Dominion. We'll answer it. So submit your questions, Always CFB, on our social media channels, where you can always email the show at alwayscollegefootball@gmail.com. So for all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day, and remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.